we good now?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, good evening to this Asia Times webinar. It's the seventh in a period of 2 months on a whole variety of different subjects of great interest to everybody. We have the great pleasure tonight here in Hong Kong to talk to a professor at the University of Tehran, Professor Marandi, who is the chair of the American Studies Department and also of Oriental Studies, and a very widely quoted, cited, and traveled as well until the recent period, professor of great and in-depth knowledge of Iran. We also have in Bangkok with us Pepe Escobar, a very old and dear friend of mine, and one of the principal roving reporters of Asia Times, going back all the way to the year about 2000. Possibly a bit earlier, correct me, Pepe, if that's wrong. Pepe is originally from Brazil, but has since then lived in pretty much every part of the world that I can think of. And the first actual reporting that he did that was excellent and called him to the attention of Asia Times was reporting from Afghanistan prior to the 9/11 incidents. And he had at that time conducted various interviews with people from the different factions in Afghanistan. And his direct on-the-ground reporting after 9/11, of course, was of extreme interest to many people. He has specialized since then in reporting from the Middle East, but more recently also extended that to China and to East Asia. He's also traveled in Central Asia, so he's been all over the place. Most importantly, of course, he's spent a good deal of time reporting directly from Iran, and this is what I think will hopefully make this a very interesting webinar for us here tonight. So without further ado, let me actually proceed to the first question. I will ask some questions, Pepe will ask some questions of Professor Marandi. And if Professor Marandi wants to ask questions of us back, we'll also try and oblige. The first half hour to 40 minutes of this webinar will be a kind of a trialogue. And after that, we will directly address questions that the attendees of this webinar can actually put into the Q&A box and ask the various participants. Professor Marandi, we talked a little bit, you and Pepe and I, prior to this about the latest polling figures in the United States and expectations that one might pin on that as to who would win the U.S. elections. From your standpoint, from the standpoint of Iran, let's say, and maybe that's identical, and maybe to what extent, I don't know. But who is your favorite to win, and who would you like to win?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer because it's really unknown what will happen in the United States if Trump is reelected.
You mean that there are uncertainties about that, or how do you want to phrase the issue?
Hello? Is there a sound problem? Maybe there is a sound problem.
Well,
Correct,
our
Professor.
apologies. We seem to have had a difficulty here with sound from Tehran.
It was a sound. The image was okay, but the sound, poof.
Yeah. Well, Pepe, let me then continue perhaps with you until we regain
Yeah, sure.
the image and voice of Professor Morandi.
Right.
From what would or what could the Iran expect in terms of the possible election outcome of a new presidency of a President Biden, or what could it expect from a continuation of the Trump presidency?
Well, from examining the Iranian media and from a few conversations this past 2 weeks or so, more or less the consensus is that if Biden wins, at least the JCPOA is back on track. Let's say this is the only redeeming factor, direct redeeming factor of a Biden win. And nobody has any illusions about a Trump 2.0, because the hostility against Iran is going to continue, basically because Trump is not going to change his overall strategy or non-strategy in the wider Middle East, right? The most important actors are, of course, Israel, then the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, then striking all these diplomatic deals involving Israel, of course. And the overall strategy is isolating Iran, if not harassing Iran, if there is any chance. So, and Iranians, it's very interesting because when you talk to average Iranians, not only in Tehran, but in the big cities, in Shiraz, in Isfahan, or that fabulous religious conglomerate in Qom, they are very realistic vis-a-vis the United States. They are not ideologically impaired. Their analyses are very rational. They understand the reasons of American administrations and the US deep state against Iran, and they have no illusions. They understand very well that basically not much has changed in this past 40 years since the Islamic Revolution. And they don't think anything changing substantially, whatever administration is in place, you know. So they're more. Sorry, yes, go ahead.
No, I mean, would it be correct to say that yes, there would be perhaps some relaxation of tension between Iran and the not just the United States but the West, and possibly even with Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries. There would be a better chance for that, presumably, under a Biden administration, a more pragmatic approach than what we have seen. Yeah.
Exactly. This is what Rouhani's people and the Minister of Foreign Relations, Foreign Minister Zarif, this is what they expect. And they have good contacts with the Democrats. This is what they expect. With the Revolutionary Guards, it's a completely different story, because they are not diplomats. They are warriors. They are military. They are, the clash between the IRGC and the US deep state is frontal. It always was and it will always be, So they also don't have illusions. But the possibility of a diplomatic opening, this is something that Team Rouhani can capitalize on early on. And obviously, it will be in the interest of a democratic administration, because their number one foreign policy priority in the wider Middle East would be to have the JCPOA back on track, right?
Great. It seems that we have
exactly.
Back. Do you want to address a question to him?
Oh, yes, there he is. Hi, Mohammed. Everything okay?
I hope so. I don't know what happened.
You had your sound disappeared.
I know.
Your picture survived for a while.
Your picture survived.
Well, as soon as I began speaking about Trump, then everything fell apart.
Yeah, let's hope we don't have a repeat of that right now.
Right.
Yeah, Pepe and I just exchanged some ideas, and it's his view that possibly a Biden presidency would be more favorable toward a relaxation of tensions than a continuation of a Trump presidency. Would that be your outlook as well, or would you disagree with Pepe on that?
Yeah, I think that's a logical and reasonable conclusion to draw. But then again, the problem is that we don't know how far Biden is willing to go. And also, a lot depends on his authority with regards to the Senate and the House. If the Senate remains in the hands of the Republicans, they could exert more pressure upon him. And there are some Democrats that are deeply hostile towards Iran, such as Menendez. And there's also another factor, and this is probably interesting to your viewers, and that is that there is a segment of the political elite in Iran that actually prefers Trump. And that is because they believe that Trump is, to put it bluntly, running the United States into the ground. He's isolated the United States. He's increasing the divisions in the country, even though there is a consensus here that whoever wins the presidency in the United States is going to be presiding over a horrific economy, and the US economy is moving towards a depression. But the belief among some is that Trump would actually be better because he is harming the United States in a way in which no other president has been able to do before, and that benefits Iran. It breaks the isolation that the United States has imposed, and the internal divisions in the United States will force Trump to look inwards rather than outwards. But I think that what Pepe has said is absolutely correct, in that Biden, even if he does nothing, there will be a psychological effect, and countries will be looking to sort of find ways to ignore U.S. sanctions, or they'll be seeking for Biden to sort of, or his administration, and especially the Treasury Department, to close their eyes to some of the activities between Iran and other countries. So I don't expect a major shift in U.S. policy either way, but there is a very interesting, let's say, division in Iran as to whether Biden would be preferable or Trump.
Pepe, you want to ask Professor Morandi a question? Go ahead.
Yes, I want to backtrack a little bit to at the time when I wrote for ourselves, Asia Times. I coined it as the beginning of the raging 20s, which was the assassination of General Suleimani on January 3rd. And this is still an open sore in Iran, in parts of Iraq, in Lebanon, in what is called in the region the axis of resistance. So my question is not a direct question, but is there, among the IRGC, is there still a mood that the assassination of General Soleimani has to be met with a proportional response over time? Of course, there was that response 5 days afterwards with those missiles in American bases in Iraq. But do you consider that, let's say, with the Trump 2 administration, let's put it this way, there could be a more forceful response to the assassination of General Soleimani? And in diplomatic terms, is this an issue for the Iranian foreign ministry, which is these are two completely different interpretations of the assassination of General Soleimani, I imagine. Very nuanced, of course. So, Mohammed, go freestyle on your answer.
Well, neither the IRGC or the Revolutionary Guards nor the Foreign Ministry are autonomous. And therefore, they both work within the framework of the Supreme National Security Council. And therefore, it is the political establishment and ultimately the leader himself, along with those senior figures in the council, that make a final decision with regards to any Iranian response to the United States. General Soleimani was extremely popular. I think it was pretty well covered, regardless of his demonization in the West. He was very popular in Iran. We saw literally, because when there are funerals or street protests or gatherings across the world, people throw around numbers like hundreds of thousands or millions. This was truly in the millions in Tehran. And in other cities that his coffin was taken, you saw enormous numbers of people. He was extraordinarily popular. And by no means do I believe that this is the end of the story from the Iranian perspective. The Iranians have made a decision to expel the United States from Iraq and Syria. And I think that that is going to be inevitable. Now, how that happens, is it going to be some major attack on the United States? I highly doubt that. But is it going to be a policy where it leads the American government to, into finally submitting to reality and leaving these countries and ending the occupation? I think so. I think what we've already seen since the US endless wars in our region is that the United States has spent roughly, well, according to Trump a couple of years ago, $6 trillion. So I would estimate that it's at least $8 trillion now. And with the situation in the United States and the extraordinarily dangerous economic situation that they have, and the bailouts and the issue of new bailouts, and the United States is not exactly in a position to sustain its occupation. So I think the Iranians are, as I think has been said often, it's sort of cliche, but the Iranians are chess players, and I think that the Iranian leadership, they are master chess players, and the Americans simply cannot outplay Iran. And to use another term, Iran has home field advantage. This area, this is Iran's neighborhood. And as you pointed out, Iran has many allies across the region, whether it's in Yemen or Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Afghanistan. Iran is influenced from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean to the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Hindu Kush, and of course the Persian Gulf. And this is the same Iran that when you traveled to Afghanistan in 2000, that was surrounded by the United States and it was isolated. To the west, we had Saddam Hussein, and to the east, we had the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all that comes along with these different animosities. So Iran's influence has expanded immensely. By no means do the Iranians feel that they've responded to the United States proportionately, but I don't think there's going to be a big event. I think it's going to be constant pressure, increasing pressure, using U.S. vulnerabilities against the United States to ultimately drive the United States out of the region.
Let me look at this from a regional perspective for a moment. Let's get the focus a little bit beyond just the Iran-US situation. There are obviously some other major players in the region. Russia certainly is a very key player, not just in Syria, but beyond that. We also, of course, have a very ambitious president in Turkey who has perhaps not exactly the ambition to restore the Ottoman Empire, but certainly somebody who would like to see his influence grow. How do you see the relationship between Iran and Russia and Turkey evolve over the next, let's say, 10 years or so?
That is very difficult. When the Turks and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Americans and the Europeans were all working together in Syria to overthrow the Syrian government, it was very tough for Iran. We know that those groups such as ISIS, they entered Iraq and especially Syria through the Turkish border and through the Jordanian border and through the Iraqi border. But the height of the, or let's say the most important border where ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the different groups were using for logistical support, for military support, was the Turkish border. And back then in 2011, 12, 13, 14, and 15, these countries were all working together. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia were on the same side. Now there's a major division after the coup in Turkey, the failed coup, and after the siege on Qatar. We see that the Saudis and the Emiratis, on the one hand, are in a struggle against Turkey, and Qatar on the other hand. And this has created a great deal of space for Iran. It has both drawn the Emiratis closer to Iran, not that the Emiratis are close to Iran, but it has prevented the Emiratis from pushing too hard or from going too much into the American camp out of these concerns that exist between the Emiratis and Turkey, or their concerns about Turkey, but also their concerns about antagonizing Iran. And also Turkey has moved closer to Iran because Turkey is now very much isolated in the Arab world. Its friends have turned to foes, and the Turks have overextended themselves in Libya, as you rightly put it. President Erdogan has major ambitions, so he's antagonized many people in the Mediterranean region, the EU, Syria, Iraq, and now by interfering in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia and sending many of these Wahhabi fighters, these extremist fighters, to Azerbaijan. He has created further tensions with Iran, because while Iran is sympathetic to the fact that the Azeris, they have legitimate grievances, but also the Iranians believe that the Armenians have they have valid points to make, and the Iranians believe that this war must end immediately and that the problem must be solved diplomatically. But Erdogan needs a win. So this is the complicated situation that Turkey is in. And of course, the COVID virus actually, relatively speaking, strengthened Iran, even though it hurts Iran, and Iran is suffering as a result of the virus. But because Iran has been under sanctions, Iran's economy hasn't suffered the way in which Turkey or Saudi Arabia has suffered. For example, because of the sanctions, Iran's oil exports are down. So the impact that the COVID virus has had on Saudi or on oil consumption has not affected Iranian earnings that much, but it has devastated Saudi earnings. Or for example, again, because of the sanctions, Iran doesn't have a big tourist industry, but Turkey does. So the economic impact of the global crisis of the COVID virus has weakened regional countries, and therefore it has relatively strengthened Iran. So on the one hand, Iran has a stronger hand in dealing with Turkey today than it had 5 years ago. And on the other hand, the Russians, because of the increasing sanctions coming from Europe and the really irrational attitude towards Russia that exists in the United States and the sanctions that have been imposed, the Russians have been sort of forced to move closer to Iran as well. Whereas a few years ago, it was Iran that was in greater need of Russia. Now Russia is much more interested in Iran than it was before. So you have Iran in a very peculiar situation where 20 years ago, as I was saying to Pepe, it was completely isolated. Now it is regionally its influence has expanded, and countries, other countries, regional countries, if we can call the Russians regional, they have a greater interest in developing ties with Iran. So Iran has a stronger hand to play today, despite all the difficulties in many respects that it had before. And that will be, I think, important in the months and years ahead, especially because I think we are living in very decisive times. And I think there will be major changes in this region in the coming months, at most within a year or two. But I do think that Turkey is extremely important for Iran. Russia is extremely important for Iran as well. And therefore, Iran would like to move the relationship in the right direction. But again, because of President Erdogan, it's difficult and complicated. But by no means is Iran interested in antagonizing Turkey, the Turkish government, or the Turkish president.
Pepe, you want to
yes,
chime in?
Can I ask a quick question, please?
Go ahead.
Muhammad, diplomatically, does that imply that Iran believes that the Astana process, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, may eventually succeed, even if you cannot convince Erdogan to get out of Idlib or stop financing the galaxy of moderate rebels that are still active in Idlib?
I think time is not on the side of President Erdogan because of the economic crisis at home and because he's of the multiple wars that he's waging. And of course, now we have the Saudis and the Emiratis pushing Arab countries to boycott Turkish goods. So time is not on his side. The Astana process is a process, but I don't believe that it's a conclusion to it has ever been envisaged. At the moment, President Erdogan, I think the Astana process has been more beneficial to Iran and Russia than to the Turks. And I think that what's happening in Azerbaijan is President Erdogan's attempt to score a win somewhere, because he hasn't succeeded in any of these fronts. And especially because of the declining economic situation in Turkey, creating this sense of nationalism and so on, some sort of victory, Ottoman victory, would, I think, be important for him. But what it does actually is that it pushes Russia closer to Iran.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that is something that, for Iran has its benefits. So the Astana process, and it benefits the Syrian government, by the way, because the Syrian government, I think that they feel that the Iranians are more adamant about Syrian sovereignty, and the Russians are more, not that they are willing to sacrifice Syrian sovereignty, but they have a lot of interest in Turkey, which they don't want to undermine. But the problem between Russia and Turkey is that their problems go from all the way from Libya, they're at each other's throats in Libya, the Ukraine, Crimea. Turkey does not recognize Russian sovereignty over the Crimea, and of course Syria, Iraq, and now Armenia. And Russia has a very close relationship with Armenia, not necessarily with the Armenian leadership, but with Armenia. And I think that's a very important point that we can
and the Eurasia Economic Union as well, man.
Absolutely. So
I
would say that.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but to sort of build out this picture a little bit. So we've talked about Turkey and we've talked about Russia. There is, of course, increasingly another power, namely China, that is interested in the situation in the Middle East and in Iran in particular. There were reports some months ago that Iran and China had actually concluded an agreement where Chinese investment in Iran might reach up to $400 billion US dollars over a period of 25 years. Is that for real? And if so, what do you see as being behind that from the standpoint of China?
Well, the agreement between Iran and China doesn't have any numbers. So the report that you read a few months ago is really a fabrication, but it is a roadmap, and it will soon be signed. The Iranian foreign minister, Dr. Zarif, recently traveled to China, and he had a very successful meeting with his Chinese counterpart. And there is a broad agreement both on the signing of this document, the text has been finalized, but also Chinese-Iranian relations. And that is another interesting point. As I was saying earlier, the United States and the Europeans, by antagonizing Russia, they've pushed Russia towards Iran. And now, through the antagonization of China, they are pushing China closer to Iran, especially because the Chinese see that Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Emirates, they will probably fold. I mean, the Israelis have already said that they're not going to allow China to be involved in in any 5G projects in Israel. So the Chinese are already seeing that Iran being independent from the United States, that Iran is a more reliable partner. Of course, the problem is that the Chinese are concerned about US sanctions. But we have to see what happens after the US elections and what the state of play is in the United States. But regardless of that, the Chinese are moving closer to Iran, and the Iranians are moving closer to China for the very same reason that China is moving closer to Iran. The same is true with Iran. When the Americans impose sanctions and the Europeans simply obey, despite the pretty words coming out of Europe, but in practice they obey Trump, then that leaves, when the door to China or Russia or other countries, when those doors are open, obviously the Iranians are going to use those doors. So what the Americans have done is that they're creating a convergence of interests between Iran, China, and Russia, and everything that lies between these three countries.
Mohammed, if you allow me a slight disagreement, it's not that the Americans are creating the integration of Eurasia as a process, and the three major poles are China, Russia, and Iran, is also a process. And it's slowly but surely, this past 2 or 3 years, they are integrating little by little. With, for instance, the Iran-China deal, 400 billion or not, 25 years or not, the expansion of the new Silk Roads and the Eurasia Economic Union and their integration also little by little. The fact that Iran for China is a matter of national security as an energy provider and also a key node of the new Silk Roads, of one of the top corridors of the new Silk Roads. So historically, and this is what I've been writing at Asia Times for the past few years, actually. Virtually everything that I write is around this major theme. This integration of Eurasia is a historical process. It's on the move, and it's closer and closer every day, even with all those flashpoints, Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, Persian Gulf, Idlib, you name it. Yeah? But just to finalize this digression, practically, can you give me an example, for instance, in terms of the Chinese who want to upgrade the installation at South Pars, that absolutely outstanding, gigantic, massive gas field. Are there already practical mechanisms for Chinese companies or Gazprom, for instance, invest in South Pars or upgrade South Pars and escape American sanctions at the same time?
A couple of things. One is that I agree with you completely. But what the Americans have done is their behavior, and the Europeans, is sort of like a catalyst. It only increases the pace of convergence between these countries. They're pushing these countries closer together, and thus pushing forward that process that you've just pointed out very correctly. in a more, at a higher pace. With regards to the Chinese, and before I respond to the question, and sort of in a response to the question, the American, and this is from open sources, this is not something that any inside information. According to the information that's out there, Iran's oil exports, despite American attempts, has been rising. And some estimates have it to be more than 1 million barrels a day, whereas at the low point, it was substantially less than that.
It was 400,000 for quite a while. 400.
That's right. So I think it's 3 times as much at least, or 4 times as much as it was during the low point a few months ago. And this is at a time when oil demand has gone down. Globally, the demand for oil has gone down substantially, but Iranian exports have been up. So this is sort of a response to what you were saying, that the fact that Iran's oil exports are up means that its customers are increasingly finding ways to ignore the United States. And that is the same is true with investment in Iran, whether it's the South Pars gas field or other oil and gas fields, or other elements of Iranian infrastructure. We are seeing an increase of investment, but mostly from the private sector and small companies. They could be front companies, and they could be companies on their own that don't have international investment here and there that they feel is vulnerable. Remember, China is a continent, and the population of China is, almost 1.5 billion people. So, there are many businesses in China that are not global, but they're enormous. They're huge in the different provinces, in the different cities. And Iran is a market that is unique because of the sanctions. They do not have many rivals. And so there are increasingly larger numbers of Chinese businessmen traveling to Iran and meeting people and investing in the country. But, as I said, there are different ways of doing this investment. So it's not necessarily going to be Sinopec that is going to be investing big in Iran, but it's going to be Chinese investors in one form or another that are going to be working with local Iranian companies or with the Iranian government to increase investment in Iranian oil and gas, in the oil and gas industry, as well as other industries.
Yeah.
Let me broaden the spectrum a little bit again, in a perhaps different direction. It's clear, of course, that over the past decade or more, the policy on the part of the United States, and to some extent, at least some European countries, has been to create a situation of isolationism, or isolation rather, for Iran. On the other hand, Iran has made efforts to break out of it in terms of involvement in Syria, involvement in Iraq. What does Iran want? In other words, does it just want to be left alone, or does it want to actually bring parts of Syria under Iranian sovereignty, or does it want to get the Shiite parts, which are large, of Iraq, sort of as a close ally? What does Iran want? Where does this all go?
Well, I mean, to Iran's credit, I would, and I know that it would, in a world of skepticism, everything is met with skepticism. But when Iraq was in a very bad place, when it was invaded by the Americans, when it was broken, the Iranians made no attempt to take advantage of the situation and occupy any part of Iraq in the name of compensation for the 8-year war that Saddam Hussein carried out against the country. And the Iranians have never actually received compensation for the Western-backed war on Iran from the Iraqi people. So having said that, and Iran is a large country. I don't think Iran has any territorial ambitions anywhere. But I think the issue for Iran is sort of, what they say, never again. And when the Americans helped Saddam Hussein invade Iran, they created mass misery in our country. And the Americans and the Europeans, and back then the Eastern Bloc as well, the Russians and Saudi Arabia and these countries were all helping Saddam Hussein in destroying parts of Iran, occupying parts of Iran. And of course, the Europeans and the Americans gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons that he used extensively and repeatedly. They gave him military intelligence to use those chemical weapons effectively, and they gave him political cover in the UN Security Council to get away with it. And those Europeans and Americans that were involved in selling chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein are still in government. They're CEOs, they're in parliament, in Congress, in the Senate, and elsewhere. So for the Iranians, the US presence in the region is always a threat. And as long as the United States has a presence anywhere near Iran, the Iranians are not going to settle down. So I think the ultimate objective of Iran is to expel the United States from the region. Now, some may say that's pretty impossible to do. But again, when we look at the hemorrhaging and the amount of money the Americans are paying and the direction in which the US economy is taking, and the fact that Iran and its allies, and its allies now, Iran is no longer alone, as we see in Yemen and in the countries that I mentioned. Iran and its allies have home turf advantage. Is this an impossible thing to envisage? I don't think it's impossible. Is it achievable? It would be very difficult to imagine it happening anytime soon. But this is, I think, the major objective of Iran, to expel US forces from the region.
On that particular point, I guess Iran does not necessarily agree with Donald Trump, right? Because he also has said repeatedly that he wants to get out of there, and has deplored the actual the actual deployment of U.S. troops, which was very costly, and these endless wars he has said he wants to end. Whether he's doing it the right way or doing it at all is another issue. But is there? Let's be thinking about this as a pragmatic or practical question. What would it take for there to be a definitive relaxation of tensions, not just between Iran and some of its neighbors, but in a global framework? What are the necessary steps in order for that to happen?
I think Iran's only problem is the United States. It's the neighbors that it has problems with have definitely been pushed into this situation by the United States. The Saudis, Iran's problem with Saudi Arabia goes back to Saudi support for Wahhabism and the creation of the ideology, or the expansion of the ideology that helped create Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and ISIS and all these other, groups that Pepe has very colorful names for them. And then, of course, even Turkey. I mean, President Erdogan he had a very close relationship with Iran until he began supporting the same groups that the Saudis have been training all these decades. And he supported them militarily, these Wahhabi groups. But this ultimately was, behind all of this was the United States. We know this from the US Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that's been partially released by Judicial Watch. And we know from General Michael Flynn's admission in an interview on Al Jazeera, at that time he was the head of the US Defense Intelligence Agency, that US allies in the region were supporting these extremist groups, and the United States took a willful decision to support these groups. So I think the only way, the road to easing tensions in the region lies somewhere between Iran and the United States. However, Trump has crossed the red line. He has murdered a senior and widely respected and loved Iranian military war hero who was the leading person to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq. And that red line is not, Iran is not going to forgive him. So as long as Trump is president, there will not be rapprochement between Iran and the United States. But that doesn't mean that if Biden comes, the relationship will get significantly better. Biden is, you know, he is a part of the U.S. establishment. He is, as some would say, Republican light. He is not a progressive. He is not Bernie Sanders. And therefore, there are no real expectations in Iran for him to make a major move towards rapprochement. The Americans like to believe that the problem between Iran and the United States began with the embassy takeover. But for the Iranians, the embassy takeover was the result of the U.S. giving refuge to the Shah. And the Shah was, in the eyes of Iranians, a mass murderer and a person that the Americans installed and who the Americans helped him create the secret police. So the Iranian grievances towards the United States go back a long way to 1953, the 1953 coup. But that doesn't mean that rapprochement is impossible. But what I'm saying is that under Trump, it's not possible. Under Biden, I find it highly unlikely. Yet, I think that the events that we're experiencing in 2020 are so extraordinary that they could bring about enormous changes, and many of those changes will probably be catastrophic in this region and beyond, that we may have a new world order or a new world disorder where circumstances change significantly. And under those circumstances, there may be a significant rethink in places like Washington. But it's not, for me, that I don't see anything in my small crystal ball.
We are, happy. Just a second. I just want to, looking at our, time constraints. We have a good deal of time left, maybe a half hour or so, and we want to go to some of the questions from our audience. And but please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, it's very quick. It's complementing your question and Mohammed's answer. In fact, this goes way beyond Biden and Trump. This is not about political parties, about one party as a hydra with two heads. Mohammed, would you realistically expect that the U.S. deep state one day will forget what happened in 1978, 1979? In fact, they never could forgive Iran for staging the Islamic Revolution. This is the key.
I agree.
This is the key. As long as this is not discussed, I would say on the same table, in a sort of super summit with American leadership and Iranian leadership, this will never be solved.
I was in Beirut a few years ago in a very small seminar, and one of the other participants was David Frum, who was a speech writer for George Bush. And he's now part of the resistance against Trump, of course, but that's another story.
He's a never-Trumper.
Yes, he's a never-Trumper, exactly. David Frum is the person who coined the axis of evil.
Yes, absolutely.
And in Bush's State of the Union speech. And that was at the time when the Iranians were actually helping the United States in defeating the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So after Iran gave help to the United States, under the reformist president Khatami, the United States responded by labeling Iran as part of an axis of evil. I spent a couple of days with David Frum. It was a very small seminar, so I spent a lot of time talking with him. His hatred for Iran was so extraordinary for me. You could not talk to this person. You cannot, in my opinion, talk reason to this person. No matter what I said, no matter how I framed it, no matter how I would silence him during the debate, and he would have to go silent because he had no argument left, it would change nothing. You know, when he raised questions and I answered them, or others answered them, and they were adequate, or at least he had no response, it changed absolutely nothing. And I think that's just one example. That's an anecdotal, you know, that's an anecdote that of my own experience that plays within the framework of your question. No, I don't believe that the U.S. deep state will ever forgive Iran. But what I am saying is that the world is changing very rapidly and in ways in which I cannot comprehend. I see a very, very dark future, although the current world order is nothing to be desired. But I think that the global economy is heading in a direction where it will be impossible for us really to know what is going to happen. But I think that it is quite possible that the changes that we will see, good or bad, will be so profound that thinking across the globe will change, will possibly change dramatically. I have no idea, but as I said, as far as I can see, I cannot see the United States changing, but I cannot see very far.
All right, let's see. Maybe some of our viewers can ask some questions that may force us to look a little bit beyond the horizon. One question we haven't discussed, obviously, if there is going to be any lasting rapprochement, any lasting, peace in the Middle East region, the one issue we cannot ignore is the relationship of Israel to the rest of the Arab world and to Iran. And the question really that has to be asked is why is and how, as has repeatedly been said, is Iran intent on destroying what it calls the Zionist state? Is there any give in that? Is there any way of looking at that in a more practical and pragmatic way, especially now that some other Arab nations are in fact making peace with Israel?
Well, first I'd like to point out that this destruction of Israel phrase is a willful mistranslation of Persian, which the American and the Western media, the American political establishment likes to use, and the mistranslation was done willfully. But Iran will not accept the Israeli regime as a legitimate regime. Iran's position on Israel is identical to its position on apartheid South Africa. So when the revolution happened, before the revolution, Iran had very good relations with South Africa and Israel. When the revolution happened, Iran broke off ties with both apartheid South Africa and the Israeli regime. And it began to support the Palestinian cause as well as the liberation movements in South Africa, including the ANC, among other resistance organizations. And if you recall, when Nelson Mandela was freed, one of the first countries that he visited was Iran. So, and he was, according to American law, a terrorist, and so was the ANC, a terrorist organization. And it was only after his presidency ended and he retired from politics in 2008 that the law was changed in the United States, making him no longer a terrorist and the ANC no longer a terrorist organization. So Iran's position so now after the fall of apartheid, Iran has very good relations with South Africa. The issue in Iran is apartheid in Palestine, the right of return, and the subjugation of the Palestinian people, which despite all of the immigration of Jews across the world into Palestine, they still, within what the areas occupied by Israel, they constitute half of the population as we speak today. And that does not include the refugees and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and elsewhere, in Egypt and elsewhere. So for Iran, this is a moral position, and the Iranians believe that the United States and the Europeans, as time goes on, despite short-term wins in their support for this regime that Iran sees as an apartheid regime, that this is not a sustainable status quo. And until now, the Europeans have been telling Iranians privately, yes, but hopefully we'll have a two-state solution. And the Iranians have always been saying from the very beginning that A, there will never be a two-state solution. The Israelis never wanted that, and this has been a show from the start. And B, beyond the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians living in what is considered to be Israel within the 1967 borders are still subjugated by and considered as second-class citizens, to say the least, by the Israelis. And even Jimmy Carter has a book on the events in Israel, and he considers this to be a form of apartheid.
Yeah, go ahead. I just there's a follow-up question, but please you go ahead first.
No. I found an interesting question. It's a story that I have been tracking this story for us for quite a long time. It's about Chahbahar port. Chahbahar port, of course, so many of you know, is let's say the twin port of Gwadar. Gwadar is part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and Chahbahar was being more or less groomed by the Indians to be a sort of gateway for the Indian Silk Road, in fact. But obviously, when you talk about Modi's India and diplomacy and geopolitics, you know what it is. It's like a stale curry, in fact. So do you have any news, Muhammad, on what's going to happen to Chahbahar now? Will the Chinese invest in the port? Will the Chinese invest in the roads? And does India run the risk of having started its own new Silk Road from Iran to Afghanistan and then Central Asia, and then abandon it? And it's now going to become a second Chinese corridor from Iran and Afghanistan to Central Asia.
I really believe that Prime Minister Modi has harmed India's interests for the sake of the United States and has really received nothing in return. And so Iran was willing to allow India to have its own space in Iran and to use Chahbahar, as you rightly put it, to create a relationship with Central Asia and Afghanistan as well. But ever since Trump began putting pressure on India to stop purchasing Iranian oil and stop investing in Chahbahar, the Iranians have been moving away from India and being more receptive to the Russians and the Chinese in particular. And there is Chinese investment in areas near Chahbahar, although at the moment there is no official expulsion of the Indians from Chahbahar. But if things continue as they are, ultimately the Indians will be out. And I don't see a situation where the Indians can remain. So I think this is going to be a major blow to Indian interests, and the Chinese and the Russians and others will benefit from it. But I think that because of the sanctions, this shift will be slow.
Uwe?
All right. Just an economic maybe follow-up question in that respect. If we look at, this is another questioner who looked at import and export situations between comparing Turkey and Iran. Iran Chinese trade relationships has significantly suffered recently. I think we all realize that. the China relationship has developed much more positively. What would you see will drive a future greater engagement of China in Iran?
I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that because of the global economic crisis that is just beginning to show its ugly head, and because of the coronavirus's major impact on this economic crisis and its intensification of that crisis, I think that while, again, as I said at the beginning, while Iran is suffering a lot from the COVID virus, in certain ways Iran is Iran is coping with the situation much better than Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others, because of the sanctions. Because of the sanctions, Iran has been forced to develop its own homegrown industries. We all know that Iran has a highly developed weapons industry, by far the most advanced in the region. And we've seen how Iranian drones, whether from Yemen or wherever, how they've devastated Saudi installations. We saw how Iranian missiles struck an American base and the Americans were unable to stop any of them. This weapons industry is the result of sanctions. And much of the Iranian consumption, if you go into an Iranian supermarket, most of the goods are locally produced. So because of the sanctions, Iran's economy is better equipped to deal with COVID virus. It's better, we didn't have all that many tourists. Industry is not devastated because we don't have a major hotel industry. And in fact, more Iranians would travel abroad than foreigners travel to Iran. So many of those Iranians who have nowhere to go to have to spend their money inside the country. So what Iran is, I think, after this crisis is over, will probably be doing much better, or will probably be in a much better position than other countries. And as China and the United States move towards greater confrontation, and you know what is going on between the United States and Iran, United States and China economically, over Taiwan and elsewhere better than I, as this confrontation moves forward and both sides need allies increasingly, I think that China will see that Iran will be a strong independent partner that it has to look to. And we are seeing signs of Chinese changing policy towards Iran, even though China is a very cautious country. They're very cautious. Changing Chinese, someone once said somewhere that changing Chinese policy is like turning a super tanker around. It's a very, very slow process. But we do see significant changes in the relationship between China and Iran, which I think will probably have an impact in the years to come.
Mohammed, just to lighten up a little bit, a quick answer. How's everyday life in Tehran nowadays? Under maximum pressure, still on. Sanctions, still on. The impact of COVID, of course. Has it substantially altered that chaotic dynamism that you feel every time that you go to Tehran? Last time I was there, I was in a traffic jam for 3 hours, for instance. So, what are the signs, for instance, of Chinese? Do you see more Chinese investments or Chinese business towers springing up? Give us a sense of everyday life in Tehran nowadays.
I would say it's mostly Iranian businesses that are thriving, and small businesses and small factories and small and export companies to Iraq and neighboring countries in particular. If you go on the streets of Tehran today, you will think it's the same as it was when you came to Tehran. And the streets are crowded, a 3-hour traffic jam would, it was probably raining if it was that bad, but you would experience traffic jams, and it would be Tehran. But life is more difficult, without a doubt. I have a PhD. I have a former PhD student. She was my PhD student. She just graduated recently. She has a small daughter who has cancer and who's dying. She couldn't find medicine for her child. And when she could find the medicine, it was very expensive, because sometimes the local medicine, they couldn't bring in the supplies in time, or the needed to make the medicine, and the foreign produced medicine they cannot import because Iranian assets are being held. For example, South Korea is holding $8 trillion of Iranian money, but they won't let the Iranians touch it. We have a shortage of test kits for corona. Iran produces its own test kits, but they're not enough. The Koreans have our money, but they won't give it to us. And so do a number of other countries as well. So this has caused people to die. It has caused people to lose jobs. It has caused inflation to go up, and the Americans gloat about it. The Americans are, they like the suffering that they cause in Iran. You saw just a couple of days ago Trump say that the Iranians are poor, and in a really pretty despicable way. But that's not just Trump's sentiments. Trump is just crude about saying it. That's how the American political establishment behaves towards Iran. Remember, these sanctions were first imposed upon Iran by Biden.
By Obama, yeah.
By the Biden administration. So what I would say is that life is more difficult, but it is not nearly as difficult as they would like. Iran is definitely not poor, but life is more difficult. People have died as a result of the sanctions. Lives have been ruined. But I think that the current economic and crisis, and the pandemic, and the growing instability that we're seeing across the world, and in particular in this region, in this struggle, Iran will outlast its antagonists. And I don't want to waste the time of your viewers, but I gave Pepe an example of Muhammad Ali, and for those of us who are older, his fight with George Foreman, and where everyone thought George Foreman was going to win the fight. I'm not a fan of boxing, but he was going to win the fight. But Muhammad Ali, he brilliantly used what he later called rope-a-dope to tire out his opponent, and ultimately Foreman fell in the 8th round. And this was probably the most famous boxing match in history. I think that Iran will definitely outlast its antagonists. And because of the sanctions, Iran has become a tough country. And this toughness will enable it to outlast this. You may have protests or riots or problems
viewers, which let me just read it to you because it's